Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, et lux perpetua luceat eis.
They were born into power, draped in silks before they could walk, baptized under ceilings of gold, called your grace before they even spoke. They were the children of a king who would split a church in half just to name a new queen, a man who sent wives to the scaffold with the same hand that once caressed their cheek, Henry VIII, King of England, terror of Europe, destroyer of monasteries, and father of three. He wanted sons. He got heartbreak. He wanted legacy. He got a curse wrapped in flesh and blood. And in the end, he left behind not one heir strong enough to carry his name forward. Because the story no one ever tells you, at least not like this, is that each of his three legitimate children died slowly, painfully, and terrifyingly alone. And they did not leave behind a single child to continue the Tudor name. Edward VI, the son he had fought and killed for, was the first to go. A golden-haired boy, born after Jane Seymour died, bringing him into the world. He was paraded as a miracle, raised with tutors and guards, watched by ministers, wrapped in prayers. But what the country saw as a healthy child was, in truth, a boy who coughed up blood before he turned 15, who wasted away in bed while rumors of poison whispered through the palace walls, who drank a potion given by a mysterious woman that made his limbs swell and his fingernails fall out. In the final weeks of his life, his body began to rot while he was still breathing. His hair came out in clumps. His bowels failed him. His breath stank of infection. And the people who saw him wave from the window in his final days did not see a prince. They saw a ghost in a boy's skin. On the 6th of July, 1553, Edward VI died whispering, "Lord, take my spirit," and left nothing behind but a shattered council, a dying line, and a crown with no clear successor. Then came Mary, the first true queen, regnant of England, known to history as Bloody Mary. But before she was a butcher, she was a broken girl. She was Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon. The wife he cast aside to marry Anne Boleyn. Mary was ripped from her mother, declared a bastard, and spent her girlhood not as a princess, but as a political inconvenience. Her health cracked under the pressure, vomiting, cramps, insomnia, bleeding. They called it strangulation of the womb. But no one really knew. She was kept under house arrest. She was nearly poisoned by her caretaker. She bled from the mouth and cried herself into fevers. And still she rose. She dethroned her cousin, the 9-day queen, married a Spanish prince, and tried to give the kingdom the Catholic heir her mother had once dreamed of. But Mary's body betrayed her. Again and again, she announced her pregnancy. The bells rang, but her stomach swelled and swelled, and then sank. There was no baby, only fluid, and pain, and humiliation. A phantom pregnancy, they said. And then another. And then came the flu that swept through England like the plague. And it found Mary in her bed at St. James's Palace, nearly blind, racked with fever, whispering prayers to angels no one else could see. On the 17th of November, 1558, just before dawn, Mary died, believing she had done God's will. Her stomach was full of fluid, her liver and ovaries swollen, her mind shattered by grief. No husband at her side, no child in her womb, no one in the corridors calling her Majesty anymore. And finally came Elizabeth, the queen who ruled for 4 decades, the Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the phoenix who rose from her sister's ashes, but even she could not escape the long fingers of the curse her father left behind. Elizabeth was brilliant, witty, charismatic, and utterly alone. She had no husband, no children, and no true heir. Her last years were marked by shadows. Friends died. Her face was painted whiter and whiter, to hide the smallpox scars that no mirror could erase. Her teeth were black and broken, her breath foul, her voice faded. She wept when her ladies died, refused food, refused sleep, refused doctors. She walked the halls of Richmond Palace like a ghost waiting for her own body to fall. She sat on cushions for hours, unmoving, staring into the middle distance. They say she saw Mary, Queen of Scots, the cousin she had executed, standing in the corners of her bedchamber. She spoke of guilt. She spoke of angels. But mostly, she said nothing. And on the 24th of March, 1603, Elizabeth finally lay down for the last time. The doctors disemboweled her, despite her dying wish. Her coffin exploded days later from the gases building inside her corpse. Her skin split open in the dark. And yet thousands lined the streets to mourn her. She had ruled them, frightened them, and held them together. And then she was gone. So that is the story. No one dares tell in full the tale of the three children of England's most infamous king. Each destroyed, not by war or treason, but by their own blood, their own bodies, their own loneliness. Not children, not Tudor future, only pain, only silence, and a kingdom that, in the end, watched them all die and moved on. He was born in celebration and died in shadows. From the moment his first cry echoed through the walls of Hampton Court Palace on the 12th day of October in the year 1537, Edward Tudor was treated not like a child, but like a prophecy fulfilled. The bells of London rang for days. Bonfires were lit in every town. Hymns were sung in churches. This was the boy who would end his father's curse, the long drought of sons that had cost England 6 queens, a shattered church, and rivers of blood. His mother, Jane Seymour, had given Henry VIII what no other woman could, a living male heir. But the price had already been paid. Less than 2 weeks after delivering the miracle, Jane fell into fever, her body wasting from infection, her hands growing cold. By the 24th of October, she was dead. Edward's birth was both the triumph and the tragedy of the Tudor dynasty. And as the wet nurses crooned lullabies to the new prince, the women of the court whispered prayers for the soul of the mother, who would never rock him to sleep. The boy was watched like a living relic. Nothing he touched went unrecorded. Nothing he ate passed without testing. Henry VIII, now aging and bloated and plagued by an ulcerated leg that stank through his boots, would visit his son and kiss his golden head, as if afraid to blink and find him gone. Edward was tall for his age, strong in the legs, sharp in the eyes, and brilliant in the mind. He loved learning, spoke Latin before the age of 5, and devoured the scriptures like sweets. But no amount of books or blessings could shield him from what was written in his blood. When he was just 4, the first sickness came, quartan fever. Some called it, though others said it was malaria. He burned with fever. He trembled with chills. His body convulsed in his crib. The physicians bled him, staved him, forced him to swallow bitter draughts made of herbs and ash. He survived, but something had shifted. And though Edward returned to his studies, to his beloved half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. To his careful role as England's treasure, the shadow had begun its crawl. When Henry died in the cold winter of 1547, Edward was just 9. The crown was heavy on his head and colder than he expected. A regency council of 16 men was established to rule in his name, but everyone knew that the real power sat with his uncle, Edward Seymour. Now, Lord Protector of England. The boy king nodded at ceremonies and recited speeches in Latin and continued his lessons. But he was already learning how little control a king could have over his own fate. His meals were examined. His bedding was changed daily. His physicians checked his temperature and bowel movements with more reverence than a priest handling the host. He was forbidden to ride alone, forbidden to walk the palace halls without a retinue. He was watched, guarded, adored, and utterly alone. In the year 1550, Edward became ill with something no one could name. He stopped eating. His skin turned pale. His voice grew hoarse. The court fell into silence. Ministers argued behind locked doors. But no word of the illness escaped to the streets of London. He recovered. But the seed had been planted. In the spring of 1552, the king was struck again, this time by measles and smallpox in brutal succession. His face blistered. His eyes bled. His throat swelled shut. For days he could not breathe without gasping. He wore spectacles now. He grew thin. His voice trembled when he spoke. Some said he was going deaf. Others whispered that this was not measles at all, that poison had been slipped into his goblet, that someone wished to end the boy before he became a man. But the court had become an expert in denial. Ministers smiled. Doctors bowed. The boy was dressed, perfumed, paraded before ambassadors who all returned home with the same whispered report: "The king is dying." By the winter of 1552, the truth could no longer be ignored. Edward coughed through every sermon, every meal. His sheets were stained with blood. His lips cracked from fever. His nights were sleepless. The chill of December gnawed at his bones. On the 15th day of February, 1553, Mary came to see him, the half-sister he had once laughed with. Now, a solemn woman cloaked in Catholic black. He was too weak to greet her properly. He remained in bed, his voice rasping, his breath shallow. That night, his fever rose to new heights, and some claimed his skin glowed with heat. Still, the ministers said nothing. Still, the people outside Whitehall Palace believed the king was reading scripture and preparing for Easter. Then came the woman. No one knew her name. Some called her a healer. Some said she was a fraud sent by those who wished the king dead. But someone, somewhere, allowed her through the guards and into Edward's chamber. She gave him a potion thick, green, reeking of metal and root. The king drank it. He screamed within the hour. His limbs swelled to twice their size. His fingers cracked at the joints. His lips turned black. They said his heartbeat thundered through the walls. The woman disappeared. She was never seen again. Edward lingered. By the 17th of March, the child once praised for his intellect could no longer hold a quill. His skin split in places, revealing sores that would not close. His stomach swelled grotesquely, pushing against his ribs. He could not walk. He could not stand on good days. He was carried to the garden and left in the sun, where his coughing echoed like a curse through the hedgerows. The doctors now spoke only in Latin. They spoke of tumors in the lungs, of ulcers, of consumption. Some said his body was full of water. Others said it was full of death. In late May, he received the French ambassador, his face hollowed, his hands trembling, his voice barely more than a whisper. By June, the fever would not break. His nails peeled away, his hair dropped to the floor in strands. His teeth loosened. He could no longer eat. The King of England, once the hope of a dynasty, now reeked of rot. Opiates were given. He slipped in and out of dreams. Some said he cried out for his mother. Others said he called for Mary. The ministers began drafting changes to the line of succession. The doctors, for the first time, used the word dying aloud. On the 1st of July, he was seen for the last time, pale, thin, trembling at the window, looking out across the garden where he would never walk again. And then, on the 6th of July, as the bells of evening began to toll across the Thames, Edward VI took one final breath and whispered, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." Sir Henry Sidney held him in his arms. The room was silent. There was no thunder, no angels, just the scent of death, and the quiet closing of a boy's eyes. His surgeon opened the body days later and found 2 ulcers black with infection in the lungs. The disease had eaten him from the inside, whether it was tuberculosis, or a cruel cocktail of plague and poison, or simply the weight of a crown, too heavy for a boy to carry. No one knows for sure. What remains is the truth of his end: long, slow, painful, the kind of death that leaves the corridors haunted and the throne colder than stone. He was buried on the 8th of August in the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey, in an unmarked grave. No name, no statue, no marble to declare that a king once lay here. Only silence, only earth, and the memory of a boy who was born to save a dynasty, and died before he could even speak for himself. She was born into promise, but lived in punishment. When Mary Tudor came into the world on a cold February morning in the year 1516, her birth should have been a triumph. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a princess of 2 kingdoms and a child of destiny. Her father adored her as an infant. He would take her in his arms before the court, showing her off like a jewel of peace between England and Spain. He called her his pearl, his sweetheart, and for a few fragile years, she was. But even as she learned her first words and touched her first crown, the seeds of her destruction were already sown inside the heart of the man who ruled her life. Henry's love was as changeable as the English sky, and when he began to tire of Catherine, her aging face, her inability to give him a living son, his affection for Mary began to rot as well. The court whispered before she understood the words. They whispered of another woman, Anne Boleyn, the dark-eyed lady who served her mother and would soon replace her. When Mary was 11, her father demanded that the Pope annul his marriage. Rome refused. Henry defied him, and in his fury, he broke England from the Catholic Church, making himself its supreme head. He cast Catherine aside, banished her to a damp estate, and forbade mother and daughter from ever seeing each other again. Catherine wrote letters that were never delivered. Mary wept in rooms where her name was no longer spoken. The title of princess was taken from her and replaced with Lady. She was declared illegitimate by Act of Parliament. Her inheritance gone. Her mother dying in exile. Her father remarried to the woman who called her a bastard. From that moment on, something inside Mary twisted and never untwisted again. She was raised on anxiety and humiliation. Her body mirrored the torment of her mind. By her teenage years, she suffered crippling cramps that left her bedridden, migraines that made her vision blur, and vomiting fits that would last for days. Physicians called it the strangulation of the womb, an illness of women who were too emotional, too devout, too disobedient. They dosed her with powders, herbs, and leeches. Nothing cured her. She would sit awake through the night, pressing her hands over her belly, whispering the Latin prayers her mother had taught her, believing that if she prayed hard enough, God would still see her as her mother's child. When her mother died, in the year 1536, Mary was not allowed to attend the funeral. She dressed in black and locked herself in her chamber, fasting until her lips cracked. Those who saw her said her eyes seemed to belong to someone much older than 19. Eyes that had already accepted that love was a lie, and God's justice came with silence. Yet she endured, even as Anne Boleyn fell from grace, and her father married again and again. Mary learned to survive by bending, not breaking. She learned the art of keeping her face still when her heart screamed. She wrote letters of obedience to her father, letters that ended with words, "She hated your humble daughter, Mary." The king's subject, she swore to recognize his new church, though her soul burned each time she spoke the words. But obedience, for Mary, was a weapon of survival. Years later, when Henry finally died, Mary was 31, thin, pale, with red hair like her mother's and a temper like her father's. She had outlived his cruelty, but not its scars. Under her half-brother, Edward VI, the country turned Protestant, and her faith became dangerous once again. She was followed, interrogated, accused. The young king's men warned her to renounce her Catholic Mass or face imprisonment. Mary refused. "I cannot change my faith as I change my coat," she told them. It was the first time she spoke as a queen, though the crown was not yet hers. When Edward died in 1553, she claimed the throne that had been stolen from her. For 9 days, a usurper named Lady Jane Grey wore the crown. On the 10th, Mary rode into London to the sound of roaring crowds. They cheered her name, waved white handkerchiefs, cried out, "God, save Queen Mary." For the first time in her life, she was both daughter and sovereign. She restored the Mass. She restored the Latin hymns. She restored her mother's memory. England, she believed, would be healed through her. But peace did not come. She married Philip of Spain, her cousin and the son of the Emperor Charles. Hoping to unite the crowns of England and Spain once again, he was tall, distant, polite, and entirely indifferent to her. Mary adored him immediately. He treated her as a duty. Still, she believed God had blessed their union, and when her belly began to swell, she believed her suffering was finally over. By April of 1555, the court announced that the queen was with child. Bells rang. Noblos knelt. Gifts were prepared for the infant, who would save the Tudor line. Elizabeth, her half-sister and rival, was moved closer to court to await the child's birth. But inside Mary's body, something was wrong. The pain began quietly: tightness, bloating, exhaustion. The months passed, but there was no quickening, no movement. Her doctors told her to be patient. She smiled, convinced the Lord was testing her faith. In June, her belly grew so large that her dresses no longer fit. She retreated to her chamber at Hampton Court, awaiting the labor that never came. Then, one morning, her stomach began to flatten. Slowly, painfully, the swelling drained away. There was no baby. There was only emptiness. The doctors stammered explanations: miscalculation, delay, false conception. But Mary understood. Her body had betrayed her, just as it always had. Her phantom pregnancy became the whisper of every court in Europe. The Spanish ambassador wrote that she looked pale and ill, and the English nobles began to turn cold. Philip, humiliated, left for Spain. Still she prayed. Still she believed another chance would come. And then, in the year 1558, her stomach began to swell again. She smiled through her tears, believing it was a sign from heaven. But this time it was not life. It was death, dropsy. The physicians called it a disease that filled her body with water until her skin stretched tight. Her feet ballooned. Her eyes sank into her skull. Her lungs drowned her slowly from within. She coughed, gasped, and whispered prayers to the Virgin, begging forgiveness for her sins, for the fires she had lit, for the Protestants she had burned. She saw angels in her fever dreams, glowing figures standing above her bed, waiting. When the end came, it came quietly. On the 17th of November, 1558, between 4 and 5 in the morning, Mary Tudor, Queen of England and Ireland, and defender of the Catholic faith, died in her bed at St. James's Palace. Her last words were said to be, "My soul, O Lord, for that it was thine." She was 42 years old. Her servants dressed her in a black gown and laid her beneath the crucifix she had kissed so many nights before. Her half-sister Elizabeth was proclaimed queen before the body was even cold. The courtiers who had once called Mary Majesty now hurried to serve her successor. She was buried at Westminster Abbey in a plain tomb, her name carved in stone beneath another Elizabeth's. Two sisters, two queens, buried together in silence, one lying above the other. As if history itself had chosen who would be remembered, they called her Bloody Mary for the burnings she ordered. But history forgot that long before she burned others, she was the one who burned first by fever, by faith, by love that turned to ash. She was the last Tudor. And she died, remembering the sound of screams, not her own but the ones she had ordered, the ones she had silenced, and the ones that had never truly stopped, echoing through the corridors of her reign. Elizabeth Tudor, the girl who was never meant to rule, became the longest reigning monarch of her dynasty. She was born into scandal, crowned in defiance, and ruled with a sharp tongue and sharper memory. But in the end, when the gold faded, when the mirrors betrayed her, when her body turned on her and her voice could no longer command the wind, she died, not as Gloriana or the Virgin Queen, but as a woman haunted by choices only she could make, and ghosts only she could see. She came into the world on the 7th day of September, in the year 1533, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the queen who had changed everything and paid with her head. Henry VIII wanted a son. A got Elizabeth. He wanted permanence. He got a girl whose mother was executed before her 3rd birthday. From the start, Elizabeth breathed in danger, like other children breathed in lullabies. She was declared illegitimate. Like Mary before her, she was shuffled between households, raised in cold castles and colder politics, watched by courtiers who measured her every move. She learned young to smile without meaning it, to curtsy, even as she cursed inside. And when she asked about her mother, the air itself seemed to change. But she learned fast. Languages, philosophy, scripture, statecraft. She studied the ways of kings and the downfall of queens. She watched how one wrong word could send a noble to the tower, how one lover's touch could become a noose. When her father died, she was 13 years old and clever enough to pretend not to be clever at all. Her brother Edward became king. When he died, Her sister Mary took the throne and tried to burn the country back into Catholicism. Elizabeth kept her head down. She bowed when she had to. She survived the tower once. She did not plan to go back. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth became queen in a world that had no model for a woman ruling alone. She made herself a myth. She refused to marry. She wore the title Virgin Queen like armor, cloaking herself in symbols, in poetry, in divine right. She spoke to her subjects with fire. She faced threats from Rome, from France, from Spain, and she survived them all. In 1588, when the Spanish Armada sailed toward her shores, she stood before her troops in armor and declared she had the heart and stomach of a king. England believed her, and in time, the world did too. But belief cannot stop decay. Power cannot stop time. By the year 1590, the Queen had begun to change. Her closest companion, Blanche Parry, who had served her since childhood, died. Elizabeth was crushed. She wept alone for hours. Then came the death of William Cecil, her most trusted advisor, the man who had been her anchor through 4 decades of storm. One by one, the faces that had filled her days began to disappear. They were replaced by younger faces, hungrier faces, ones that smiled too much or not at all. Elizabeth, now nearing 60, began to pull away. She wore her signature white makeup thicker than before, hiding the pockmarks left by smallpox. Her hair, once the color of burnished copper, was now a wig. Her teeth, yellowed and broken, made her speech hard to understand. She knew it. She hated it. She demanded portraits be touched up, paint me as I was, not as I am. She had once been adored. Now, she was endured, but she refused to go quietly. She danced when her joints ached. She held court when her voice shook. She wore gowns that shimmered under candlelight, even as her bones thinned beneath them. When courtiers whispered of her age, she laughed and made them tremble. When her favorite, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, rebelled against her and raised arms in London, she wept in private, then signed his death warrant with a steady hand. When they brought her his ring, and she turned away and said nothing. And still the years came. By the winter of 1602, Elizabeth Tudor was nearly 70 years old, a ghost of herself walking through gilded halls. She had not named an heir. She trusted no one. She barely ate. Her ladies laid cushions all around her chambers in case she fell. And yet she would not rest. Her nights were filled with wandering. She paced the floors in her nightgown, refusing to lie in her bed, muttering under her breath. Servants swore they saw her speaking to people who weren't there. They heard her whisper names that hadn't been spoken in years. Robert, Anne, Mary. Then came the death of Catherine Howard, not her cousin, the Queen who had died by axe, but her beloved servant, the Countess of Nottingham. Elizabeth collapsed. They said her cries echoed through the palace like a child mourning her mother. She shut her doors. She refused to change her clothes. For days, she sat motionless on a pile of cushions, staring at nothing. They brought food. She waved it away. They brought music. She did not listen. They brought priests. She turned her face to the wall. She was shrinking, dissolving into herself. By early March of 1603, the court began to prepare. Ambassadors waited in silence. The Archbishop of Canterbury was summoned. The Queen still would not lie down. She sat upright for hours on end, her fingers trembling, her lips dry, her eyes no longer focused. When someone finally whispered, "Your Majesty, you must rest," she looked up and said only, "I will not go to bed. I know if I lie down, I will not rise again." They feared she would die sitting numb. Eventually, exhaustion conquered her stubbornness. They carried her to her bed. She did not sleep. She lay there in silence, her breath shallow, her thoughts somewhere far away. She spoke to no one. And then, slowly, the whispers began. "She is dying." On the 24th day of March, in the year 1603, Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of a beheaded queen, a sister of a burned one, the ruler of a golden age, closed her eyes and did not open them again. No child wept at her bedside. No husband held her hand. No blood of Tudor remained to follow her. Only servants. Only silence. But the story did not end there. Though she had begged not to be embalmed, her surgeons did so anyway. When her coffin was sealed and laid in state at Whitehall, strange things began to happen. Weeks later, when it was moved, a terrible sound cracked through the abbey, a loud, splintering bang. Those close enough to hear it said it came from within the coffin itself. When they opened it, they found that her body had ruptured from within. The buildup of gas had forced the wood to break. Her face had blackened. Her hair had slipped from her scalp. The Virgin Queen, who had ruled for 44 years, had exploded in the silence of death. She was buried in Westminster Abbey in the same vault that held her half-sister Mary, one Protestant, one Catholic, one remembered as glorious, the other as bloody, but both laid together. The bones of two women who were taught never to trust each other in life, now resting inches apart for all eternity. Elizabeth Tudor outlived them all. Her father, her siblings, her favorites, her enemies, even her own myth. But in the end, she did not outlive her regrets. She died hearing footsteps in the dark. She died thinking of the cousin she had executed. She died without leaving behind a single heir. And perhaps, more than anything else, she died knowing that the Tudor name, once carved into banners and battlefields, would be carved instead into the final stone of her tomb. They ruled in gold, but they were buried in silence. One by one, they slipped beneath the earth, not to rest, but to be forgotten. First, the boy who bled from the lungs, then the woman who thought she was pregnant with salvation, and then the queen who died with powder on her cheeks and ghosts at her door. When it was all over, when the final breath had been taken, and the last drop of Tudor blood had dried in its royal veins, England looked up from its mourning veils and realized something no one had dared to say aloud. The dynasty that had fought so hard to be born had died. Not with a bang, but with a breath, a cough, a fever, and a slow collapse into the dirt. The Tudors had ruled with thunder. Henry VIII had torn down abbeys, burnt heretics, built palace, seduced queens, and screamed his name into history. His children inherited the crown, but none of them inherited his fire. Edward had worn the crown as a boy, but never ruled it as a man. Mary had tried to reign with righteousness, but her womb was empty, and her name was scorched. Elizabeth had lasted the longest 44 years of power wrapped in velvet and flame, but she left behind nothing but a tomb and a myth. They came into the world to fanfare, but they left it quietly, beneath stones that bore no children's names, no heir's hand, no future's promise. They left no dynasty. They left no sons. They left no bloodline to weep beside their graves. Edward VI was buried on the 8th of August, in the year 1553. In the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey, there was no monument, no carved effigy, no golden crown atop a slab of marble. The boy king, who had once been England's great hope, was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, hidden beneath the stones, walked over by centuries of strangers. He had ruled for 6 years, but never alone, died before his 16th birthday, and left behind nothing but suspicion. Some said he had been poisoned. Others said he had rotted from within. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that his body, so carefully monitored in life, was buried without fanfare. And the only words spoken over him were in a Protestant rite that half the kingdom still feared. There were no sons, no mourners in black who carried on his line, no tearful queen to press his signet ring to her lips. Only a few loyal servants, a closed casket, and a crown that passed to a cousin who would be dead in 9 days. Mary I was laid beside Elizabeth in name only. They shared a tomb, yes, but not an inscription. For many years, her name wasn't even visible on the stone. She had ruled for 5 years, burned hundreds of Protestants. We tried to bring back the old faith, and died, believing she was carrying the child of God's promise. She had no state funeral like her father. Her body was not carried through the streets on a golden barge. She died in the early hours of the 17th of November, in the year 1558. And by midday, her sister had already been named queen. Her court evaporated. Her servants defected. Some even stole her possessions. She was buried quickly, quietly, and without a crowd. She had asked to be remembered as a daughter of Catherine of Aragon. But instead, she became the queen whose name was whispered in fear and then forgotten in silence. When James I ordered the tomb to be remade decades later, it was Elizabeth's name alone that shone in gold. Mary's was etched beneath, almost as an afterthought, almost as an apology. And Elizabeth I, who had turned her body into a kingdom and her face into a symbol, was buried in glory. But even that glory did not last. She died on the 24th of March, in the year 1603, in Richmond Palace, surrounded not by children or family, but by trembling ministers and silent women. Her funeral was immense, stretching across London, with thousands of black-clad mourners lining the streets. They said the air was thick with sobs, that people wept openly, that bells rang from every steeple. Her body was placed inside a coffin lined with lead, her insides removed against her wishes, her skin powdered one last time. She was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, first in the vault of her grandparents Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and then later moved to a separate tomb. But when her coffin was lifted for transport, it cracked. Gas had built up inside. Her corpse had bloated, swelled, and split. The Virgin Queen, who had once dazzled courts with her wit and war, exploded in her silence. The tomb where she was finally buried stands opposite that of Mary, Queen of Scots, the cousin she executed, the woman whose death haunted her dreams. In life, they had competed for power. In death, they watch each other forever, encased in cold stone, their stories told in marble, but their bodies long gone to dust. No heirs visited. No sons wrote letters in mourning. No daughters laid flowers. And this was how it ended. Not with a sword drawn in battle. Not with a usurper climbing over castle walls. Not with a betrayal at midnight, or a fire in the chapel. But with sickness, with stillness, with rooms filled with coughing, and praying, and fading light. A boy who died choking on blood. A woman who died with nothing but fluid in her belly. A queen who died sitting upright, afraid to close her eyes. And when it was done, the crown passed not to a Tudor, but to a Stuart James VI of Scotland. Now, James I of England, the son of the woman Elizabeth had killed, the Tudor line died without children, but not without consequence. Its end reshaped the kingdom, redrew its faith, reopened old wounds, and left behind a memory stained with fire and crowned in myth. But the truth, the raw, aching truth is that for all their splendor, for all their brilliance, for all the songs and plays and paintings they inspired, the children of Henry VIII died alone. Not one of them was held by someone they loved. Not one of them was kissed goodbye by a son or a daughter. Not one of them died, knowing that their blood would live on. Their portraits hang in palaces, but their names were carved into cold slabs of stone by strangers. Their bodies were perfumed and buried, but their lineage was a closed chapter before the century ended. And when the last Tudor heart stopped beating, the bells of Westminster rang, not for a dynasty reborn, but for a silence that would stretch across generations. Long after the Tudor children were gone, long after their bodies had cooled, their crowns passed on, and their portraits began to fade. Beneath layers of smoke and dust, something lingered. Not a dynasty, not a bloodline, but a weight, an hecho, a burden that no one alive wanted to touch, and no one dead could fully release. The Tudors had ended. Yes, but not with peace. Their coffins remained, buried beneath marble, sealed in vaults, hidden behind carved angels and Latin prayers. But every so often, when the night was long and the stone turned cold, it was said that those coffins creaked. In Westminster Abbey, time doesn't move the way it does elsewhere. Light filters down from stained glass, like colored breath. Footsteps never quite disappear. The air smells of incense and limestone and something older than memory. And beneath the floor of the Lady Chapel, where the Tudors lie, nothing ever truly sleeps. The tomb of Edward VI rests with no name. No statue. No royal effigy. Visitors walk across the stone unknowingly, stepping above the bones of a boy who died gasping for air. Lungs full of blood. Body wasted from disease. There is no sign. No gold. No gilded wreath. Just stone, and beneath it, silence. But some who worked in the abbey, in the long centuries after, spoke of strange things, of flickering lights and whispers caught between arches, of a scent like fever sweat, sudden and sharp, coming from nowhere, of dreams about a boy in white, holding a Bible, standing at the end of the aisle, with eyes too hollow to be alive. A canon once said that during renovations, the stone above Edward's grave would not stay. Level, it rose slightly, imperceptibly. Every night, they relaid it 4 times. No one asked why. Mary lies beneath Elizabeth, buried in name but not in triumph. Her phantom pregnancies are long forgotten by history books, but the women who clean the chapel at dawn claim that in the months closest to November, a low sound can sometimes be heard, a moan, like a woman in labor, deep and steady, just beneath the tomb. Others say it's just the stone shifting with the seasons. But one night, in the year 1772, during a rare opening of the vault, a visitor wrote in his journal that as he passed the tomb of Mary Tudor, the air grew unbearably warm, and his ears began to ring, as if, he wrote, I were standing too close to a great furnace with no flame. He left within minutes, and never returned. The journal was found among his belongings after his death. The final page had been torn out. Elizabeth's tomb stands taller, more defiant, carved with grandeur, watched over by winged statues and Latin verses of victory. But even her rest has not been undisturbed. When her coffin was moved in the early years of the 17th century to be interred above her sisters, the wooden casing cracked. The abbey workers said the noise was like a musket shot. When the lid was briefly lifted, the attendants saw that the body had swelled, bloated by the gas of decay, and that her skin had blackened and burst. The embalming had failed. Her organs, removed against her wishes, had not saved her from ruin. The face of the Virgin Queen, once powdered, once praised, once painted by Holbein and adored by poets, was now unrecognizable. The velvet of her gown had fused with her flesh. Her hair, once red like fire, had disintegrated into dust. But it was the sound that haunted them. The snap, the pressure, the creak of the coffin exploding from within. For years afterward, no one would go near her tomb alone at night. One Ferger, tasked with locking the chapel doors at twilight, and swore that he once heard breathing slow and labored coming from behind the stone slab. He refused to enter again and left the abbey service within the month. The Tudors had left the stage, but they had not left quietly. Their deaths had echoed, and their bodies, even in decay, refused stillness. Some said it was guilt. Some said it was grief. But others, older abbey keepers, ones who still whispered Latin prayers before passing the Lady Chapel, believed it was because the Tudor children had carried something. No one else dared carry again the full, naked weight of their father's sins. Henry VIII had broken a church to have them. He had destroyed monasteries, stolen relics, beheaded wives, executed servants, annulled marriages, and thrown Europe into chaos, all to produce an heir that would outlast him. And yet, not one of his children could hold what he left behind. Edward, given the crown at 9, died before 16. Mary, crowned with hymns, died with no child, and the name bloody carved into her legacy. Elizabeth, hailed as the Savior Queen, died childless, alone, and afraid to lie down, convinced that sleep would bring death. It did. And so, no one carried the Tudor legacy forward. Not by blood. Not truly. James I wore the crown. Yes. But he was no Tudor. He was the son of the woman Elizabeth had executed, the cousin she had called a traitor. When James took the throne, he inherited a kingdom, soaked in Tudor glory, but starved of Tudor heirs. The line had ended not in fire, not in betrayal, but in bodies that could not bear children, wombs that swelled with ghosts, and hearts that gave out in silence. The legacy the Tudors left behind was too heavy to lift, and perhaps that was the point. Perhaps what Henry VIII created was never meant to last. He had ruled through fear. His children ruled through survival. And when survival turned to stillness, the kingdom changed. Parliament grew stronger. Monarchs grew weaker. The divine right faded. The Stuart line would never burn as bright. But it would last longer. No coffin of theirs ever cracked open. No priest ever claimed to hear wailing in their tombs. But the Tudors, they stayed. In stone. In myth. In the cold echo of creaking coffins. They remained. Not because they ruled forever, but because they died memorably. Because their deaths were strange and unfinished. Because they left rooms half-lit. Prayers, half-whispered. Stories half-told. And even now, in the quietest hours before the abbey doors open. If you place your ear to the stone near the Lady Chapel, some say you can still hear something faint, a cough, perhaps a breath, the sound of a crown falling to the floor in a room where no one remains. They were the most coveted rooms in the kingdom, once these royal bedchambers where kings were born and queens had whispered secrets that changed the fate of nations. Here, silk sheets had tangled in trembling hands. Here, royal mouths had kissed and cursed and conspired. And yet, after the deaths of the Tudor children, after Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth had each slipped from this world, the same chambers they had once slept in, prayed in, and died in, fell into an uncanny quiet. No servant wanted to tend them. No noble wanted to inherit them. The tapestries grew heavy with dust. The fire grates rusted from disuse. And worst of all were the candles, because they would not stay lit. It began quietly, almost foolishly. The keepers of Hampton Court, Whitehall, Greenwich, Richmond, those palaces soaked in Tudor breath, began to notice odd things. Fires that refused to catch. No matter how much kindling was stacked, wicks that sputtered out. Even when shielded from the breeze, wax that melted too fast, as if weeping itself away before the flame even touched it. And always in the same rooms, the nursery where Edward had once coughed until his lungs tore, the chamber in Greenwich where Mary had dreamed of cradling a son that never came, the high-vaulted sleeping room at Richmond where Elizabeth had paced for days, refusing to lie down, fearing that the pillow would steal her breath. These were the rooms that refused warmth, that swallowed light, that made even the most loyal chambermaids cross themselves before entering. One servant wrote in a letter to her sister that when she was ordered to dust Elizabeth's old bedchamber, the air inside was so still, it felt like stepping into water. Every movement echoed. The sheets had been removed, the tapestries folded, the hearth long dead, but still. She said, the feeling of being watched never left her. When she lit a candle to begin her work, it sparked and died. She lit another. It flared, then hissed into nothing. After 3 failed attempts, she fled. Her report was dismissed. The Queen, after all, had been dead for years, but she refused to enter again. Richmond Palace, where Elizabeth died in the year 1603, was the worst. After her death, the royal apartments were left mostly untouched for months. When James I visited, he ordered the rooms to be aired and fresh linens placed, but within a day, the servants sent to prepare them came back pale-faced. The bed had collapsed. Though no one had touched it, the hearth had turned black, and the tapestries along the wall had torn from top to bottom, not shredded, not gnawed, but torn as if by unseen hands that had grown tired of waiting. It became so well known among the court that the Queen's rooms at Richmond were cursed, that James eventually ordered them stripped and dismantled. The paneling was burned, the mattress destroyed, the stone around the hearth repurposed, but still, strange things happened. A candle left on the windowsill would crack the glass beside it. Footsteps were heard long after the furniture had been removed. The floorboards creaked at midnight. And once, in the depth of winter, a guard assigned to the eastern corridor ran screaming from his post. He claimed he had seen a woman standing just outside the chamber door, tall, pale, with a face that looked not dead, but long unused. Mary's rooms were no better. Hampton Court Palace held the memory of her phantom child like a wound that would not scab. Her confinement chamber, where she waited for labor that never came. was locked for decades after her death in 1558. No one wanted to clean it. No one wanted to repurpose it. Every attempt to repurpose the space for new queens failed. The candles wouldn't stay lit. The fires died down to ash. No matter how many logs were added, one maid said she heard soft weeping, as if someone were sitting in the corner, hunched over a cradle that wasn't there. Eventually, the room was sealed. Edward's old rooms at Westminster were less disturbing, but perhaps more tragic. The walls still bore the painted coats of arms given to him when he was crowned at 9 years old. The windows looked out onto a garden where he had once taken his final walks. But no one wanted to sleep there. The bed was too narrow, the ceiling too low, the air too thin. It wasn't fear that kept people away, it was grief. The kind of grief that wraps itself around your ankles as you walk and whispers that something is missing here, something that never got to grow old. When candles were lit in those rooms, they burned cold, with barely a glow. When fires were made, they smoked. When musicians tried to play in the hall below, their strings snapped. It was as if the boy who had died so young had taken all joy with him. Over time, people stopped speaking of these things aloud. They didn't need to. The servants passed the warnings in glances, the maids in half-spoken jokes. "Don't light a candle there," they'd say with a smirk and a shiver, "or she'll blow it out." Visitors were taken through other halls, shown other beds, fed other legends. But always, in the margins, the truth waited. The truth that the rooms where Tudors had lived, had truly lived and died, were no longer rooms. They were mausoleums, and in every one of them, something remained. Not ghosts, perhaps, not in the rattling chain sense, but something old, something exhausted, something that had seen too much and could not forget. The candles told the story best, time and again. When relit, they would flicker, hiss, and die just like the Tudors themselves, born in fire, extinguished by silence. You can still visit some of these rooms today, though they have been repainted, refurbished, renamed. But if you stay long enough, if you linger in a corner when the guide has moved on, if you kneel near the hearth after the last tourist has gone, you might feel it. The draft that isn't from a door, the scent of something faintly like illness, the knowledge that you are not alone in a room that has forgotten how to be warm. And if you dare to light a candle, just one, just for the sake of it, watch it carefully. Watch how it flickers. Watch how it resists. Watch how it seems, even in flame, to shiver with the memory of royalty that once lived and never truly left. It settled slowly, like regret this dust. It crept into the folds of velvet cushions, gathered in the grooves of carved oak panels, drifted beneath canopies of state and down the backs of forgotten thrones. The palaces of the Tudors had once shone with ceremony and smoke and the rustle of silk sweeping through stone corridors. But after the last child died, after Edward gasped his lungs apart, after Mary watched her womb turn to water, after Elizabeth sank into herself and vanished into shadow, the dust began to settle. And no one knew how to stop it. They tried. Of course, the Stuarts who inherited the crown moved through the rooms with their own intentions. James I brought his court, rearranged the tapestries, imported new furniture, hung portraits of foreign ancestors. But it never quite worked. The dust came back, always the same places, behind the thrones, beneath the beds, in the chapel stalls where Elizabeth had once prayed, in the corners of Hampton Court's corridors where Mary had walked, bloated and pale, gripping her skirts like they might anchor her to the living. They swept it. They scrubbed it. They whispered about it. Still it returned. And worse than the dust was the silence. It wasn't the silence of peace. It wasn't the hush of reverence or rest. It was the kind of silence that felt like a held breath, like a palace waiting for someone to walk back in. It echoed in the halls where Henry had once roared with laughter and rage. It hovered over the high-backed chairs that no one sat in anymore. It seeped into the bricks. It clung to the mirrors. It was the sound of absence made permanent. Elizabeth's throne in the old presence chamber remained untouched for years after her death in the year 1603. No one wanted to sit there. Even James delayed, preferring other seats, other palaces. When eventually a new monarch did sit upon it, they complained that the wood felt strange, slanted, like it tilted ever so slightly backward. An illusion, the carpenters said. But the discomfort remained. Servants refused to polish the arms of the chair. A musician refused to play in that room alone. And the throne was never moved. As if rooted by something heavier than stone. It wasn't just a room that remembered. It was a whole country. England itself seemed to carry the Tudor silence, like a bruise hidden under lace. The people still spoke of Gloriana, of good Queen Bess, of the virgin monarch. But the stories had become thin, powdered over like Elizabeth's own face. And when they spoke of Mary, it was with flinches and fire, Bloody Mary. They called her never the daughter of Catherine, never the girl who wept for a mother she could not touch. Edward, too, was forgotten, blurred into the fog of reformations and regencies, and remembered only in the shadows of those who ruled for him. And still the dust gathered. In the royal pews at St. George's Chapel, in the arches above the choir stalls at Westminster Abbey, in the folds of the draperies hung for coronations that now felt like echoes of a voice no one quite recognized. The Tudor name was carved into stone. Yes, but it no longer breathed, and where breath once was, dust came instead. There was a chambermaid at Greenwich, many decades after the dynasty's end, who claimed that every time she swept the northern corridor, the one leading to the rooms where Henry had once held his children, her broom would catch on something invisible. She would sweep, and the bristles would stick, as if snagged by a thread that wasn't there. She reported it once. The steward told her to keep sweeping. She quit 2 weeks later, said she'd dreamed of coughing blood into her hands, said she'd heard a woman sobbing behind the wall, repeating the same 2 words over and over, "I'm sorry." The silence in these places was not just empty. It was active, alive in its stillness. It pushed. It resisted sound. Ministers who practiced speeches in the old halls found their voices dulled. The words wouldn't carry. A violinist once claimed that no matter where he stood in the long gallery of Hampton Court, his music always fell flat near the center, right beneath the beam where Henry's crest was carved, the same place where Anne Boleyn had once danced, the same place where Elizabeth, as a girl, had watched with wide, uncertain eyes. Dust, silence, and the weight of memory that no one wanted to name. There were attempts to cleanse it. In the early 18th century, reformers suggested removing all relics of the Tudor era from court life portraits, coats of arms, tapestries bearing the Tudor rose. A movement began to reshape the narrative, to polish history, to make it neat. But even then, they could not shake them. Elizabeth's image, reimagined and romanticized, crept back onto plates and coins. Mary's name, though reviled, refused to be erased from the stained glass of chapels she had funded. Edward's youth haunted educational reformers who used his precociousness as a symbol of intellectual purity. The Tudors had failed to produce a lasting bloodline, But they had managed something stranger. They became ghosts that could not be swept away. And that was perhaps the cruelest legacy of all. Not glory, not lineage, but persistence. Their physical bodies had long since turned to bone, then to ash, and then to the fine, gritty powder that mixes with stone beneath abbey floors, but their presence remained not in form, not even in spirit, but in atmosphere, in the way candles leaned in their direction, in the way rooms resisted noise, in the way no amount of soap or polish or vinegar could fully rid a throne room of the smell of dust, of old wool, of breath once held too long. It was said by one royal housekeeper that if you tried to light incense in the Queen's Gallery at Richmond in the month of March, the month of Elizabeth's death, it would smolder strangely, not go out, not blaze, just hover, like a spirit reluctant to leave. And perhaps they didn't want to leave. Perhaps they had died too strangely, too painfully, too incomplete. Edward, with his unfinished reign and poisoned lungs. Mary, with her unborn children and endless prayers. Elizabeth, with her powdered lies and regretful ghosts. They had nowhere to go. They had no line to walk down. No child to carry their name. No warm hand to pass their rings to. The only thing left was dust and silence, and history that refused to settle as easily as the air beneath the velvet ropes. And so it lingers still, in the places you cannot visit, in the locked rooms beneath the abbey, in the corners no one cleans anymore, in the silences that fill the space after tourists leave and before candles are snuffed, in the knowledge that some thrones were never meant to be sat on again, and some names were never meant to be spoken too loud, because if you speak them, if you listen too closely, you might hear the dust stir. You might hear footsteps across the floor. You might hear the echo of a child coughing, or a queen whispering, apologies in a language no one has spoken for 500 years. Close your eyes and imagine a world lit only by flame. Candles flicker in long corridors. Bells toll somewhere beyond the mist. The scent of smoke and stone fills the air in that silence. Before kings were photographs and queens were headlines, there was once a family golden, blood-soaked, brittle, a dynasty built not on peace, but on hope that always broke. They were the Tudors, and they ruled for little more than a century. Yet century later, we are still listening for their footsteps, still turning their names over like coins lost in a field. We say Tudor England, as if it were a fixed point, a single painting, a single throne, but it was not. It was a wound that never quite healed, a son that didn't live long enough to lead, a daughter who bled for sins that weren't her own, a queen who wore white powder to cover the shadows on her face and signed death warrants with a trembling hand. We study them not because they were perfect, but because they were human in a way that history usually tries to forget. It began with Henry VII, tired, cold, victorious. He ended a war, married a York, and created a myth, but it was his son, Henry VIII, who took the myth and cracked it open with fire. He ripped apart the church for love. He made saints into heretics. He named himself head of a faith he barely followed. He changed wives the way the moon changes, shaped 6 women, 6 heartbreaks, 2 executions. And for what? For a son. But sons do not always live, and daughters do not always forgive. Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, the 3 children of a king who believed legacy came from blood. But their stories tell a different truth. Edward died before he became a man, a child rotting from the inside while ministers argued over his soul. Mary died, praying for a child that would never come. Her stomach full of water, and her kingdom full of smoke. Elizabeth died alone, whispering regrets to the ghosts of those she had outlived. Afraid to lie down in the bed where sleep meant surrender. Not one of them had children. Not one of them passed on the crown to a face that looked like theirs. The dynasty ended not with war, but with withered bodies and unspoken grief. They ruled England, but England did not remember them with tenderness. It remembered them with awe, with fear, with the kind of reverence that keeps you from knocking too loudly on a locked door. They built palaces, but they left behind no homes. They signed laws, but they left behind no comfort. Their portraits still hang Edward, looking too wise for his age. Mary caught in the flicker between fury and devotion. Elizabeth cloaked in stars and silence, but the rooms they once warmed are cold now. Their beds are display cases. Their letters are folded in archives. No one reads at night. The silence they left behind is not just in the abbey or the gallery. It's in us, because England still carries them not in blood, but in shadows. In the way power speaks in whispers, in the way women are still punished for not bearing children, in the way thrones, real or imagined, still expect perfection and purity from those who sit on them, and yet offer no mercy in return. We still speak their names, not always kindly, but always carefully. We call Edward the boy king, as if youth were a title and not a tragedy. We call Mary bloody, as if a woman's pain must always be retold in fire. We call Elizabeth the Virgin Queen, as if she belonged to no one, when in truth, everyone took something from her. And when we walk through the stone halls of Westminster, or gaze up at the painted ceilings of Hampton Court, we may forget for a moment that these were children, not symbols, not marble, but children raised in shadows, shaped by fear, denied softness, and given crowns in place of comfort. What do you give a child who is told that their body belongs to a nation? What do you take from them? Without even meaning to. You take rest. You take peace. You take the ordinary gift of dying in the arms of someone who loves you. Without an audience. Without a scribe. None of them had that. Edward died with ministers at his bedside. Mary died while her court abandoned her for her sister. Elizabeth died, surrounded by silence, and people too afraid to speak the truth. There was no hand to hold. No lullaby. Only duty. Only shadows. And so, here at the end of their story, we must speak the words they never heard. You did enough. You were more than your blood. You were more than the throne. You were children, and you deserved more. If we must remember you, let it not be only through portraits and politics, but through the ache you left behind. Let us remember the cracked coffin, the swelling lungs, the damp sheets soaked in fever. Let us remember the sound of fire in the courtyard and the sob in a chapel pew. Let us remember not just how you ruled, but how you endured. And how, in the end, you disappeared. And so the Tudors sleep. If they sleep at all, beneath stone, beneath stories, beneath centuries of dust and speculation and silence. They have no heirs, but they have us. And now you know them, not as legends, but as echoes, not as monarchs, but as people. And that, perhaps, is the only crown they ever truly needed. So tonight, let the palace grow quiet again. Let the candle burn low. Let the air settle into stillness. The Tudors are gone, but the silence they left that for you.